we keep hearing from the Trump administration that it's going after criminals. And in fact, about 8% of the people they have arrested have criminal convictions. The rest do not. So that's 92% of people don't have criminal convictions. What they are doing is they are defining anybody who has broken an immigration law as a criminal, even though that's a misdemeanor, it's not a felony. But that's how they got around that language, which, by the way, before the election, I had it out with a MAGA Republican who said I was wrong. And here's a newsflash, I was right about that. But I just want to point out in this moment, because of this bill, that the idea that undocumented immigrants are criminals is a construction. It is a way, a lens to look at the American economy that the Republicans have deliberately constructed. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that throughout our history of agribusiness, which is going to be after about 1880, when the Great Plains and the West really come into play as big factory farms as opposed to family farms. The idea when the Republicans put in place things like the Homestead Act in 1862, for example, was they had this fantasy that Nebraska was going to be full of little family farms, the same way that Massachusetts was, and that this was going to support democracy and everybody was going to be able to feed themselves, and you were going to have all these little towns all over the American plains and the American West. But the reality was that until we got decent kinds of irrigation in those places, it really wasn't possible to farm that way. What did happen was we got irrigation we got irrigation in those places, but that's really expensive. Getting water was expensive. So from the beginning of farming in the plains and in the West, we had agribusiness. That's not what they called it at the time, but we always had very large farms, and those very large farms depended on migrant labor. It wasn't always racialized. In fact, if you think about the 1890s and into the 1900s, many of the people who worked in those fields were white migrant workers. That's going to change in the 20th century. But our agribusiness has always depended on migrant labor, on cheap migrant labor that comes in, plants a field, harvests a field, and gets out and goes somewhere else. That's just the way it has always been. So if we're going to change that, which is certainly possible to do, we can do anything we want. Americans are going to have to get used to the idea of paying significantly higher amounts for food. But so what happened? So the people who managed who did most of the migrant labor in the American West, most of it, not all of it, tended to be, because I'm not going to really talk about the Japanese and the migrant laborers who came from the West and from the oceans, but who came across the border to work in agribusiness, did so really quite freely until the 1930s. People just came across the border to the US from Latin American countries and went back after the harvests. Things moved very easily. Especially after the 1907, Japanese workers are discriminated against much more severely than they had been before. So fewer of them tend to come, but other migrants just come back and forth. And of course, when the Depression hits in the 30s and nobody's got any work, a lot of the migrants in that area turn against the Mexicans, especially, have come across the border, as well as against people from Oklahoma. I remember the Okies and the Arkies from Arkansas, and they push them back across the border. But then World War II hits, and all of a sudden the government's like, crap, we need more workers again, especially agricultural workers. And the government starts a program called the Bracero Program in 1942. And from 1942 into 1964, the US government backed workers who would come from, especially from Mexico, into the US to perform migrant labor. But the idea was that those people would be protected because they would sort of be official, but employers pretty quickly also hired unofficial workers and treated everybody terribly. So the Bracero program breaks down for a number of reasons in 1964. because of the treatment of the workers, because of the increased mechanization, and most especially because Congress takes a look at the old 1924 Immigration Act, which set quotas for countries and had no quotas for Latin America because that was essentially an open border, and said, we really got to change the way we are doing quotas for various countries because our system is so incredibly racist. Because there was, in 24, they set up quotas for different countries to be able to send people to the United States. And some countries that they didn't like had like 0 people, and other countries they did like had lots and lots of people. And they said, in this 1964 post-colonial period, we got to change that. When they changed that with what's known as the Hart-Celler Act, they put a cap on Latin American immigration for the first time. And what they did was they capped it at 20,000 people. Not specifically, they did that in a lot of countries, but that's what happened. 20,000 people were allowed across the border. But 50,000 people were the people that were required in the fields. So that made 30,000 people illegal, undocumented when they came across the field, when they came across the border. And what happened then was that Congress recognized that they'd created a real problem. So in 1986, they remember that they write a new bill and they give amnesty to the people who are already here. But and they try to crack down on employers who are hiring undocumented labor, but they also begin to guard the border. They militarize the border. And when they militarize the border, that means that people who have undocumented people who have come over don't dare to go back because now they're going to have a problem coming back again. So instead of fixing the problem, it exacerbated the problem. What has happened since then is, first of all, that in part because of American agricultural practices, there's been and political practices, there was an explosion of violence in a number of countries in Latin America, and a number of people came from them seeking asylum in the United States, which is legal. It is legal to seek asylum in the United States. And then during the coronavirus pandemic and immediately after it, especially, a number of migrants from other countries who had landed in countries in South America were pushed out of those countries because their economies turned so bad so quickly. And the U.S. economy under Joe Biden was booming. So a lot of them simply came to the U.S. where we were desperate for workers. And so this is how we've gotten to the problem that we have, where we have undocumented immigrants who are in the United States without having the correct paperwork. They are not criminals. That idea that somehow MS-13 members are fighting to get into the US is this hellscape fantasy that MAGA Republicans have embraced. And the kicker here is that twice now, Congress has tried to pass laws that would reform this system so that the number of workers the US needs could be here legally. That happened first a number of years ago. And if you remember House Speaker John Boehner, it passed the Senate, but House Speaker John Boehner refused to take it up in the House because he wanted to keep the issue alive as a political issue. And it happened again when Joe Biden took office. The first bill he asked Congress to pass was one that would address the desperate need for more border enforcement, for more immigration judges, and to get through the huge numbers of people that there was a backlog for in the US. And Congress wanted no part of it until finally the House of Representatives under Mike Johnson said they would not look at helping Ukraine fight back against Russia until somebody did something about the border. So when that happened, the senators there was a group of senators who worked all the way through Christmas to create this actually quite strong border bill that was mostly what the Republicans wanted. And it was all set to go through. And Donald Trump said to the Republicans, don't pass it because I want this issue to run on in 2024. They didn't pass it. And here we are. All right. The whole reason I set that up, that long history, was because the other thing that happened today, in addition to the bill that extraordinarily puts more and more funding into detention and interception of undocumented immigrants by people who at least are said to be ICE agents. Their faces are covered and they are not wearing any badges. So I remain a skeptic until I know more about it. The other thing that happened was the president went to Florida to visit the newly operative detention center in the Everglades. And people are using this cutesy little name called Alligator Alcatraz. And it is a detention center that consists of cages in tents for undocumented migrants who are caught in this system that we have created. And Trump and a number of the people around him, including Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, seem to think it's kind of a joke to put people in a swamp in Florida during hurricane season, surrounded by alligators and pythons. And Tommy Tuberville, a senator from Alabama, talked about migrants in the cities as rats the other day. And if you can't look at that and see the dehumanization that leads to tragedy, then you're not looking. And that worries me, not only in the short term for our neighbors who will be sent to these detention facilities. And of course, now, if this bill passes, we are funding even more detention facilities to the tune of billions of dollars. But to go back to where I started, the idea of a president who is above the law, what we are seeing is the construction, not just of a fantasy of one man, because Trump is not mentally healthy. He lost it again today. He's not going to be here forever. He's just not. 79 years old, mentally losing it. My grandchildren are not going to be dealing with Donald Trump, but my grandchildren are going to be dealing with the world that this administration is leaving behind. And the construction of these facilities, the ICE agents who are pulling people out of their cars and out of their homes for the crime of being caught in a labor system beyond their control that our Congress has refused to fix because the Republicans like being able to accuse migrants of being bad influences on the U.S. so that they can turn out their white nationalist supporters. The construction of that system, once it is here, will be very difficult to get rid of. And once we get rid of the undocumented migrants in our midst, which, by the way, is already wreaking havoc on the construction industry and the food industry and so many things, it seems to me significant that Trump talked today about deporting, stripping citizenship from, or otherwise getting rid of the citizens in our midst who are speaking out against the Trump administration.